Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung Earthlets, and welcome to the lockdown tapes from the 2000 AD Thrillcast. I am your host, Molch-R, and on this episode we are talking to artist Carl Critchlow. Now, anybody who was reading 2000 AD in the 1990s will remember Carl's painted work, but he has had something of a renaissance in 2000 AD in the Rebellion era with a much more pared-down style. And it was fantastic to be able to talk to him about his journey from Thrud the Barbarian, which was the series he did for Games Workshop's White Dwarf magazine, all the way through to Judge Dredd for 2000 AD. And he's back in the prog this week, next week, sometime around there. Who knows what time is? It's an ephemeral construct. I hope you're enjoying the Thrillcast tapes, Earthlets. Don't forget 2000 AD and the Judge Dredd magazine continue to be published during this period. Make sure you pop along to 2000ad.com for all the latest news. Short intro for me this time. I'm going to go straight into the interview with Carl, and it was an absolute pleasure to be able to chat with him. No video on this one, I'm afraid. Gone old school. So, sit back, relax, and let's chat along with Carl. We're chatting away because you've got a new Dredd story in 2000 AD, but I don't think we've ever really chatted before, and I'd love to get an overview of your career because you were a staple of 2000 AD when I started reading regularly in the 90s,
right?
And you've become on and off contributor to 2000 AD in a kind of very different guise. In the 21st century. But let's just go right back to the beginning, because your background is very interesting, I think, because you weren't really into comics, were you?
Not really, no. Well, it was only that when I was at art college, a sort of sixth form art college, the graphics tutor there was Brian Talbot. And I was into, at the time, back in the day, I was into sort of fantasy type stuff, sort of Frank Frazetta and all that kind of, Chris Foss, all those sort of people, and Roger Dean, all the sort of 70s icons. And I hadn't really had that much to do with comics. But what I did know was that Frank Frazetta in particular started his career drawing comics. And the word was back in the day that, the reason he can draw figures so well and everything else is because, the working at the coalface is drawing comics. So that sort of sparked my interest, but I didn't know much about them. Got to know Brian. Brian used to go around. I used to go around to see him at his home, at his studio, and it opened me up to all sort of French artists, Mobius, and people like that. And absolutely, he's got a fantastic eclectic comic collection, and that sort of opened my eyes to what was available, and that sort of sparked my interest, and it sort of went from there, really.
Because I'm detecting a particular northern twang to your voice.
Okay.
Do you want to tell me a little bit about your background, where you're from?
Well, I was from my family. My parents are from Liverpool, Bootle technically, but Liverpool. I moved out to a sort of market town, Ormskirk, on the sort of Lancashire edge of things. I went to school in Ormskirk, and then because we were in Lancashire, when I went to college, the local college, we got sent up to Preston. So and that was where Brian was. So that was where sort of that sort of northwest sort of bit. And since then, since I've sort of left town, I've always lived in Southport on the coast there. So sort of halfway between the two. So that's my sort of area. That's my sort of stomping ground when I hang about. Yeah.
Right. I did some growing up in Blackburn, so.
Okay. Not too far away. Yeah. Well, near. Yeah. Sure.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Brian Talbot and the whole art college thing, because when I still lived up kind of Rochdale way, I met Brian for the first time, and
right.
He seemed to be so involved in that kind of educational side of things, like doing talks and lecturing and all this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, the great. After I left, this was until just it sort of fizzled out. This thing when he moved over to Sunderland. I think he made it big with sort of mainstream with Alice in Sunderland and all that sort of stuff because Mary's wife got a job at the sort of university or the Poly or whatever it was. So I moved over there, but they used to have this fantastic thing. It was the Preston Speculative Fiction Group, and there was Brian and Stephen Gallagher, the sort of horror writer, and a few other people that we used to come and go. And the guest list that they used to get there was absolutely unbelievable. And anyone that they had Ray Harryhausen came down there. We had Ray Harryhausen. Oh yeah, absolutely. Of course, anyone that knows anyone in the comic world knows Brian. So Dave Gibbons and Alan Moore and Bill Sienkiewicz. Glenn Fabry Glenn and everyone from 2000 AD, Alan Grant. You name them, anyone came along there. But Nick Park as well. He came down a couple of times because he's a local lad. And just as I say, the list, you wouldn't believe the people that used to get in this room about various pubs around Preston. What used to, and it was quite the thing. Yeah, but he was absolutely always keen on pushing, spreading the word and getting other people involved in comics and getting them out to a wider audience. Absolutely, yeah, a bit of a missionary zeal. Yeah.
I just that list of names is remarkable, and to Preston as well.
Oh well, that's it. Well, that's it. A lot of them were just sort of pals of Brian's, and he'd sort of say, "Well, come up for the weekend," or and they'd sort of come and stay with Brian, and then part of the deal was they'd go for this, go doing the talk, and then go out for a meal afterwards, or go for a meal before rather in this sort of curry house, and then do the talk, and then and that was that. But as I say, the list, there's a cranky old website. I say there's the Preston Speculative Fiction Group. There's got the remnants of an old website up there, with like a sort of early '90s website with a list, a guest list, and you just impressed. You would not believe it. Yeah, absolutely. Ramsey Campbell used to, because he was a pal of Stephen Gallagher's, used to sort of call in every now and again. People outside the sort of the comics thing. There was it had Terry Pratchett up there a couple of times, and as I say, anyone that you can think of. Oh yeah, they came down. Yeah, absolutely.
Because when you knew Brian, that was when he was already working on Luther Arkwright, wasn't it?
Well, he was. Yeah, when he was sort of part time at the college, and he was done. I think he'd done the first Luther Arkwright book, and he was just. He was just finishing it off in the sort of first. I was there for 2 years in the first year, and then in the second year, I think he just got his break with 2000 AD. Then he was doing the sort of Nemesis ABC Warriors stuff, and then I think that was after that he was able to sort of pack it in and go full time. But that was the sort of stuff he was doing around the time. I sort of got to know him and was getting taught by him. Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about Carl Critchlow at Art College, because you mentioned a bunch of influences earlier, and the one that I've seen mentioned most in interviews with you is Frank Frazetta.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what you were getting up to as you were having this incredible world of comics revealed to you.
Well, basically, that was. There's not much to tell really, other than that was there was all that sort of stuff kicking about. You could go into, but it wasn't like today on the as you probably not on the internet. You were stuck to what you could find kicking about in the likes of W.H. Smith's or whatever. And I remember the first time I sort of came across. The sort of Frank Frazetta's the original sort of collected book that came out for his stuff, and then the Roger Dean book at the same time. That was when I was about 15 or so, and I sort of fell on these things, and that was me. and that's the kind of stuff I wanted to do until I met with Brian. We sort of took a slight diversion off and started doing a few comics, and never quite got back on track.
The late 70s was a remarkable time for art in general, and I just wanted to chat through some of your formative influences. I'm thinking about my boss Jason Kingsley and the effect that something like Hawk the Slayer had on him.
Oh right, yeah,
and continues to have on him. I mean, was it a purely art thing for you, or were you kind of caught up in this general movement towards kind of fantasy epics and things like that?
Sure, yeah. Well, I was a big fan of I picked up on through the covers really. I picked up on the original, the Robert E. Howard, the original Conan stories, and I was working my way through those at the time, and that was a sort of and sort of Michael Moorcock and all that kind of caper. I was reading all that sort of stuff at the time, yeah. And then you think, well, this has all been done. You can't do, like you were saying, the Hawk the Slayer or whatever. A lot of these things, they've been done. So if you wanted to do your own sort of take on it, and also even though I did enjoy them thoroughly, there was sort of part of me that didn't take them quite sort of as seriously as they probably were intended, and there was always they seemed ripe for parody, and that's where Thrud came along, because I was asked by Brian, the project at the end of term was to do your own comic strip, and then that's where I came up with the idea of Thrud, and that sort of took, and then Brian sort of said, well, this is okay, we'll try and get this put in a sort of fanzine somewhere. He took it along to one of the primitive cons they used to have at the time, and got it placed in a fanzine called Arkansas. And then I did a couple of shorts, 1 or 2 pages for them. And then Paul Duncan, the guy's name was. And then a friend of mine was into his Dungeons and Dragons, had a couple of copies of White Dwarf kicking about, and there was a small lad in the back looking for a comic strip. So I just had these Thrud things kicking about. I thought, well, I'll send them in just to see how we get on. And they basically sort of, this was while I just started college in Liverpool. And this was in the first year. I think or was it between, it was either the first year at Liverpool or the year in between finishing at Preston and going and getting into Liverpool. And they just sort of wrote back and said, right, when can you start? So that was me, and then I was doing that every month for a while, and then that was when it sort of got the way of working, to deadlines and everything else, and that was it. And then from there, I progressed to working for after seeing the way Brian went, working for 2000 AD was obviously the next step on the ladder. That was the goal. So I was trying to get in there for a while, without much success. But it was always the editors at the time said the stuff I was doing was too cartoony, which it was, but it was supposed to be cartoony, and it wasn't really. To be fair, it wasn't really up to snuff. It was only that when Simon Bisley came along with the painted stuff, and also the tone changed. The whole sort of tone around then was a bit more sort of serious. It was with the Dark Knight and the Watchmen and everything else. Everything was a bit more sort of po-faced, if you like, and sort of mean and moody. And then sort of Bisley came along, and everything was rock and roll and over the top. And I was experimenting, doing bits and bats of painted stuff, and they were looking for anyone that could do anything like that. And they said, right, you'll do, and that was it, really.
We'll come to that bit in some more detail in a minute. I just want to go back to Thrud, because it's a character that I was aware of as a comic reader in the late 80s and early 90s. But do you want to describe the premise behind Thrud the Barbarian? Well,
basically, I mean, there was really, it comes from, the whole thing comes from, and I can never remember the name of it. There is one short, well, most of them are short stories, a Conan story, where there's been, he turns up in this town, and he gets lodgings at the and this place is living in fear, and the natives or the inhabitants are all terrified of this. Nobody's not quite sure what. So Conan turns up, gets board and lodgings in this little rooming house at the edge of town, and goes to bunks down for the night, and then in the middle of the night, this mysterious creature comes in and disturbs him, and of course he jumps up and knocks 7 bells out of it and saves everyone. And it always struck me as, well, how did he know? The sort of thing is, well, it could have been the guy coming in to say if what sort of if you wanted bacon and eggs for breakfast, and he still leap up with his sword and knock 7 bells out. And he thought, well, there's this could do with there's it just struck me as being a sort of peculiar thing, and I thought, well, I could run with that and take it to its logical conclusion. That's kind of what I did, and tried to. And there's obviously plenty to go at along these things. These things do tend to take themselves far too seriously, in my opinion. So it was sort of ripe for parody, and that was kind of the spark, And as well as with this brief from Brian, I knew that I didn't have the sort of subtlety and imagination of the writer to come up with an intelligent, unique spin on these things that would progress the genre any further. So I thought, if in doubt, just send the whole thing up,
Well, what's the appeal to you of the character of the barbarian?
Well, I don't know. It's just sort of strange sort of thing. It's as I say, it's the you can look into it very sort of I don't know. Well, that's it. I think the whole thing, the same with Tarzan and all these these American heroes of the sort of 1920, this sort of fantasy thing, because the European thing is more like a sort of Tolkien-esque, and it's dragons and it's groups of travelers and all that kind of thing. But the American thing, whether it's John Carter of Mars or Tarzan or Conan, or it's the lone hero against the, and it's basically the Wild West. And I think it was the fact that these guys in the 20s, the generation before, you'd had these sort of roughy tufty cowboys going out and taming the wilds, and then their sons and generations after that were basically working in offices, and for the railroad company, and they wanted a bit of the action that they missed out on. And I think there's kind of an element to that in the appeal of it, But I think you have to go psychoanalyzing it a bit far for that. But that's kind of whether that's the appeal for me personally, I'm not sure. But that's my sort of theoretical view on it all.
I guess also it kind of helps that if you know your anatomy, then you don't have to draw many clothes because they all wander around.
Well, yeah, exactly. That's it. Well, it's the same with superheroes, isn't it? I mean, that's another thing. But it's as you progress and as your tastes change and everything else, you tend to sort of veer off into different directions. But at the time, certainly, yeah, that was probably part of the appeal. Yeah.
I'm always intrigued that Thrud, which began in 1983, being published, was only slightly predated by Sergio Aragone's Gru the Wanderer, which kind of lampoons the same thing, but from a very European way of doing it.
Yeah, well, I deliberately did it because I'm aware I'm sort of only too well aware of my own sort of limitations and sort of I'll be a sort of terrible old plagiarist if I've got the opportunity to. I've never ever read any Gru at all for that simple reason. I've seen it pictures of him and everything else, and I'm totally aware of him. But I deliberately didn't read any, because if I start reading that, I thought, oh yeah, that's what I should be doing, and that'll be the end of that. So I steered well clear just in case, and still have really. I've never really read any Gru for that very reason.
Because that satirical element that's there, taking the piss a little bit, lampooning the very po-faced way that an awful lot of fantasy was presented. Where was that come from? Is it always? Has satire always been there for you? Is it something you've always wanted to do? Have you always had a kind of sense of humour?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm not sure. I really remember when I was. I mean, and I still have never put this into it. One of the thrusts. When I was about, I must have been about 11. There was a pal of mine at school, and his dad used to read the sort of Conan books and everything. And I remember him telling me about this thing. And I was at the time, I was very sort of nonplussed. I said, well, where is it supposed to be, and where are we, and what is this? And I couldn't make head or tail of it. But I remember him saying there was a story called The Snout in the Dark, where Conan is stuck in this dungeon somewhere, and this monster, it's just like a big. All you ever see is, as it says, the snout comes and tries to this enormous creature. And I remember doing a doodle even then of this enormous snout, and then somebody lights a torch, or the lights get flicked on, and there's like a massive snout on a pair of little spindly legs, and then when it's revealed, it sort of takes fright and runs off. So even then, I was sort of fairly, even though I enjoyed it and enjoyed the imagery and everything else, I would always fairly sort of skeptical about it. I don't know quite why. It's just my take on these things, But these things, whether it's a thing about the coming from Liverpool and everything else, who knows? It's just one of those things.
It may well be in your DNA, quite possibly.
It might be, yeah. That was what Ken Dodd used to say. That it's a brave man that walks down Church Street in Liverpool wearing a top hat, because someone will knock it off. Yeah.
For those who haven't read Thrud, what's a kind of standard Thrud story? Is it entirely playing around in the same universe, or do you throw elements in as they kind of occur to you?
Well, yeah. When I was working for Games Workshop, it used to be I used to throw everything else with the kitchen sink, because I was limited to one page, and also there was various. In White Dwarf, there would be various things going on. So whatever game was being pushed at the moment, there was the Dark Future stuff, the sort of Mad Max stuff, which I did some work on. And then in the middle of it all, that was when the Warhammer 40K thing kicked off. So I would try and just for the sake of having something a little different, I would try and throw a bit of that in. But when I've been doing the comics, there's a fairly it's just a fairly standard fantasy universe. I mean, I've got ideas of various other things to throw in if I ever got back to doing it again, but it's fairly basic stuff, really. It's just sending up all these standard fantasy tropes, So nothing really no maps or anything like that. You can't really find your way around particularly. So just whatever I fancy throwing in, I shall tend to have a go at.
I'm not sure it's proper fantasy if there's not a map at the beginning. Surely.
Well, this is true. Well, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So so sue me. Yeah.
I mean, this was very popular in White Dwarf, which was Games Workshop's magazine.
Yeah.
I remember quite a few publications in the 90s that had their own little comic strip. As you say, quite often a page, usually at the back, and usually taking the piss out of the very thing that they're published in. So there's a lot of in-jokes and things like that. Do you think that is what kind of lent it its appeal that everybody could get the joke because it was that kind of captive audience who knew all these tropes that you're playing with.
I presume so. I think so. Yeah. I mean, I'm probably not the right person to say, but I mean, it did kind of run out of steam in the end. But that's down to, it's a difficult format. I mean, I would never say I was any sort of a writer, and to come up with you've got one page every month and a very limited set of tools, and you've got to have a sort of beginning, a middle, and an end. Within however many panels you can fit on that one page. It's it's very. The first few are fine, but then you soon. I mean, I was doing it for about 5 years, and I think it ran its course. But then, I don't know. A lot of these things when have a natural life, and then. But I think that's it. Though I think it is the people that. Well, it used to be, like you say, with magazines and everything. These sort of small worlds. I suppose it's the same. Now people have their different, universes and everything else, but now it's all online. But it used to be a sort of cut and paste thing with you get the photocopier out, and then so the things got slightly more professional and get a few things printed. But yeah, I think that is part of the appeal, definitely. Yeah.
Clarify my mind. You'd been at Preston, and then you went to study at Liverpool.
Yeah.
And that was that art college as well, or?
That's right. Yeah,
right,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. I was doing graphics. Yeah. But I never. I mean, as I was saying to you earlier, all the time I was at Liverpool. I was doing bits and bats of freelance stuff for Games Workshop and other people, and then it kind of fizzled out. Towards the end, there's a pal of mine that I used to knock about. He left. And then I sort of drifted about a bit, and then I was looking for. I couldn't really nail down any sort of subject for a dissertation, and the dissertation would have been taking up a lot of. Obviously, it's a full-time course, but it's a lot of written work and theorising rather than actually hands-on drawing and painting. And I was doing all this other stuff on the side, so the two weren't rubbing along together very well. And in the end, I just sort of, and they said, well, there's no point packing in the pay and work because you're only going to college to get the qualifications to go out and get some pay and work. So if you got the pay and work, you may as well stick with that. In other words, they probably think, well, that was the sort of the line they kind of, but also they're probably thinking, well, you're never, you're wasting your time here really because you're not that interested in any of the other stuff we're trying to sort of get you to pick up on. So, there could have been an element of that to it as well,
The sheer number of people I've interviewed over the years, artists who've been to art college and then either been kicked out or left early because they wanted to pursue a career in comics. There must be a couple of generations of art college lecturers who curse the invention of the comic medium.
There's always one every year, I think. Yeah, absolutely. But it's a strange thing because, now you can look at the other thing at the time you didn't realise is that it seems to be very much, without realising really, they're sort of towing the party line because there's thousands of particularly American, well, and I suppose French and European illustrators and big famous names, especially in America. And that would have really, if I'd have known about these people at the time, that could have, really fired my imagination. But it was limited to, there was only a certain take on illustration and the sort of the whole business of in general. And if you didn't, and in the 80s, it was very, very much, it was a strong style going on. And if you didn't fit in with that, people didn't want to know. You're absolutely all that sort of stuff we were talking about earlier, all the Frazetta stuff and all that. That was absolutely naff. That was get out of here. What are you doing, contaminating our place with this? It was all, can't think of the guy's name. What's he called? The hypnosis guy, George. I can't remember. Anyway, never mind. But it'll come back to me. but what I was trying to do nobody quite got it. The tutors or anything weren't quite didn't know what I was on about. So they were probably glad to see the back of me, to be perfectly honest. But there you go.
So, when you were you left out college, you're doing Thrud for Games Workshop's White Dwarf.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned earlier that you were trying to get into 2000 AD as well. Having had this experience with seeing comics from the inside, meeting all these people, having Brian as an art lecturer. By this point, were you like a fully paid up comics fan?
Well, to a point, because you got to remember that they're back then still. Practically the only there was only still a couple of comic shops in London. There's only the Forbidden Planet and a couple of other shops in London. And then there was, as I said, this pal of mine used to go and stay with him in Birmingham, and there was a couple of big shops there. But as far as local comic shops and that kind of thing went, there was a couple. There was one in Liverpool. I kind of lied. I used to go to the one in Liverpool, but it was a very limited selection. It was as I say, the internet has sort of spoiled everyone, and you can see anything that's ever been. But the local comic shop would only really have the latest releases from DC and Marvel every month, and a few other bits and bats at the time. And so I suppose it was mostly through using Brian's collection as a bit of a lending library. Really, I would pick up on these things and take a few home and then read them and bring them back. But it was, again, a lot of sort of Mobius, that kind of stuff, and then even some Richard Corbin, all these kind, not straight, certainly not superhero comics, Well, the big two that came along at that time was the Dark Knight and the Watchmen. But I picked up on those, Cerebus the Aardvark and stuff like that, So yeah, I was picking up on comics, and then also the studio, Bernie Wrightson and Jeff Jones, those sort of people, but not really mainstream comics as such. But I was finding my way around what was out there. Yeah.
In I think 1984, so not that long after you'd started doing a Thrud on a regular basis, you were in Warrior.
Yeah, that was a weird one because I was doing stuff, getting things, trying to get my act together and getting these things together. And I just sent some stuff off to Des Skin on spec, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's great, and we'll put in." Which is, that was just like the whole White Dwarf thing, sort of completely out of the blue. I'm just you hear all these stories about people getting piles of rejection letters and thank you but no thank, which I've got a fair few of, I've got to say. But Des liked it for some reason, so he just threw that in there, which is nice, because he said it, I think at the time he said it was one of the only unsolicited subscriptions that submissions rather that they'd had that went in there. So that was unbelievable, really. But yeah, again, you have to ask Des what he liked about it. But yeah, sure.
That was what was it called? Black Currant.
The Black Currant. Well, he's obviously in the same in the Thrud universe. He's the sort of arch nemesis of Thrud. He's in there quite a lot. So yeah, but that was just a solo effort. It was, again, just playing around, seeing what I could do with storytelling and whatever in a limited way. Yeah.
Around this time, you, like you said, you were also doing bits and bobs for Games Workshop. You were providing illustrations for games, I believe.
Yeah, well, I said it started. I mean, you're knocking about you're dealing with the John Blanche was the art editor at the time, and he was always very kind to me. He always looked after me, and I would be sending various submissions in and all samples and things, and they'd say, "Oh, well, we got a little article in White Dwarf that would so you do a few little spot illustrations for this." and then excuse me, and then this one of the things they brought up was this game Dark Future, which was as like I say, like a Mad Max type thing. Well, that was me at the time. I had bikes and stuff, as did John Blunt. So they said, "Oh, you're a pretty good fit for that," and I got the gig as being the main artist on the game, setting the start of the game, and that was a lot of the work I did. And after that, I got a few other games where I was they just work for hire, freelance. If you think your face fits, then you I mean similar sort of idea to working with 2000 AD. If they think you're suitable for a particular project, they'll get you on board, and they've got a pool of freelancers they can call on. And I said, "Oh yeah, you'll be suitable for this. How do you fancy doing a couple of months' work on this particular project?" And it sort of builds up from there,
I'm interested in the culture at Games Workshop around White Dwarf, because the symbiotic relationship between Games Workshop and White Dwarf has always interested me. In that,
right?
It was it was essentially a sales magazine. It was like a catalogue, essentially.
It turned out like that. Yeah, it didn't used to be, but it sort of went. It did. I mean, that was one of the reasons. That was again. That was as the whole thing changed. The whole company and the ethos and everything else seemed to change with the advent of the Warhammer 40,000 and and then it was the sort of technology thing, because there used to be lead figures or white metal, but there would be individually sculpted figures, which would be fairly expensive to produce and time consuming and all the rest of it. Well, Brian Ansell's great brainwave was that if you could go over from instead of producing the figures in white metal, if you go over to produce them in plastic, then you can get a legion of 100, stormtroopers for tuppence halfpenny. You can still charge for them, but you can bang them out like shell and peas. So, and therefore, on the back of that, your tabletop gaming can have legions of soldiers, rather than like a Dungeons and Dragons one-off or series of 4 or 5 protagonists mooching about on a quest, So the whole dynamic of it changes, so it becomes more like a traditional sort of war game operation, and that was when it all sort of turned, and that was when it went absolutely big time. And then at the same time, it became more of a sort of package where anything that didn't fit in with the Games Workshop universe, like Thrud, was kind of surplus to requirements. So that was when I got the HEFA, which is fine, because it didn't really, as I say, it was run out of steam anyway. That's fine by me. There was no hard feelings at all on that one. But that was the time when it all went, and the old sort of old school type people, and the same with the shops, because if you remember at the time, your sort of role playing game shops, fantasy shop, role playing game shops used to be in the basement of a model shop. You get a normal model shop that would be selling your Airfix kits and Tamiya and all those sort of things, World War II mainly. And then downstairs in the basement, the gloomy basement, you get these sort of weirdos with the role playing stuff. But Brian Ansell said, "No, we want a proper shop on the high street with the people aren't frightened and saying, 'What's this?' And the kids can come in and everyone can come in." And that was his strategy for the whole thing, which proved very successful. And now, and since then, there was game shops in every major city in the land.
I suppose that culture change meant that, as you say, things like Thrud were not really fitting in with what they envisaged for the company, really, as it transitioned from fantasy into more your kind of sci-fi dystopian stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's fine. That was what they had, a sort of vision, and stuck with it, and it was a very successful one. So that's that's fine. That's the way these things go. You know, you can't turn back the clock. But it was the development, and it was, as like a lot of these things are. Same with, you know, the printing of small press comics and everything else. You know, the technology means these things become possible. So as soon as you can mold these things, doing injection molded plastic with the producing these things to some sort of standard, that immediately changes the way you can get the things made, and it becomes a mass market, bigger scale thing. So you've got to change the whole thing, or it means you can change the whole thing to suit, you know.
Because I do see some people. I don't do 40K or anything like that myself, but I have friends who do.
Right.
And some of the older ones kind of look back on the early days of Games Workshop in the early 80s with a great deal of nostalgia and kind of, you know, rose-tinted longing and all this, that.
Oh, sure, yeah. Oh, yeah. I believe it was a sort of golden age. Yeah, if you read any of these things, and the Oldhammer, all these sort of people saying that. Yeah, definitely. And they had a great team of people working there and everything else. But these things move on. And that's the way again. I was I went down there a couple of times. They had it was the design studio, which is in the middle of Nottingham, in low pavement in Nottingham, and they had the sort of warehouse on the outskirts somewhere, and then the design studio where all the sculptors and the artists and everything else was in this little sort of suite of offices right in the middle of Nottingham city centre. And then just as I finished working for them, I didn't go, but I used to go over there about once every 12 months for various reasons. And then the last few months I was working for them, they built where they are now, the big sort of custom built. The whole complex is out on the big industrial estate out somewhere on the outskirts of Nottingham, and they moved everything out to there, and that was part of the same thing as well, you know.
So where were you at this time? Because you mentioned that you were into bikes, and I recall photos of you with long hair. I'm getting a real picture of this.
Right,
this bike driving, D&D
sure.
playing artist. I mean,
I would never played a game of D&D in my life. I wouldn't know where to start. No. That's it. That's yeah. I'll put you right on that one. No. I'll draw the pictures, but that's the last thing I want to do on my day off. You know. So
that is amazing.
Yeah. Well, that's the same with Magic. I mean, I've been working for Magic the Gathering for 20 years. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you how to start. I wouldn't even know how to. Not a clue. I don't know. But that's just me being awkward, really, I
suppose. So, in terms of your interest, then, so outside of work, you weren't a war gamer, but clearly you had an interest in things like bikes.
Sure.
What were you like when you weren't working?
Well, basically, at the time, there was a sort of gang of us. Well, we used to just ride around on motorbikes and things, and mess around and be in the garage, stripping these things down and trying to build, chopper bikes and various other things, and customize things and all that kind of caper. That's where I was at that time. Yeah. So that was what I was like on my day off. Yeah.
Right. Amazing. Because so Thrud ended in White Dwarf in 1988,
right?
And it wasn't until sort of the early 90s that we properly saw you in 2000 AD. I'm curious what you were doing in that period between those two things.
I'm trying to think. It was. I was probably I did that was around the time I did the because I didn't seem to have any sort of I was busy-ish. I mean, not full time busy. I think basically after Thrud finished, I was for a couple of years I was still working more or less full time for Games Workshop, but I said that was when I was doing the Dark Future thing, because I mean that was I mean I must have done a couple of hundred illustrations for the actual rule book and everything else, so I didn't have time. I mean, that was another thing. They said, well, you know, I didn't have time to sort of break off every couple of weeks and do another Thrud strip, and they said, well, the Thrud strip's not really going anywhere anyway. It doesn't really fit in with what we're doing. So why don't you just pack that in and carry on doing the other stuff, and we'll keep you busy. And I think they kind of did, and I was doing various other, you know, rule book illustrations and stuff like that, just job and illustration work for Games Workshop, out thinking about it. So that would have been what I was. So even though I wasn't doing the Thrud thing, which really, when it started out, it was only really one page a month. As the other stuff ramped up, I would have probably been working for them as much as full time. Oh, and then there was Blood Bowl and a few other things that I was working kind of nearly full time-ish for them on a lot of the other projects. Yeah.
When you came to 2000 AD, your style was very different to the work that you've been doing on Thrud. Had this come out of your work doing illustrations for Games Workshop? Because it was a highly painted, highly worked style, whereas, you know, Thrud had been black and white at the beginning, and you know, as you say, fairly cartoony. How did this style for 2000 AD come about?
Well, it was just, it was just, again, I was dragging myself back to it. I was trying to teach myself how to paint when I ever got a chance. The black and white work was the work that you could get, because back then you were limited to printing process and everything else, meant that apart from the sort of, what they were at the time, the sort of low-endish, because that was another thing. I was working for a couple of bike magazines, Backstreet Heroes and stuff like that, doing spot illustrations, one thing, but apart from the covers and things, a lot of the internal pages were all black and white on these kind of publications. So that was where the black and white thing, it was necessity, really. So I've been trying to teach myself to paint and stuff like that, and it was just really, I think that was it, that I've been trying to get work off 2000 AD, and then the big change that got me my sort of break with them and my sort of my in was the fact when Simon Bisley came along and was doing the fully painted Slain thing. Suddenly everyone they were going nuts for people that could paint, and I'd done just a couple of posters and things for various sort of, well, the bike magazine. I've done a sort of centre spread and a couple of other bits and pieces of things. And they sort of said, well, can you paint? So yeah, like, not, you know, no, but and proceeded to learn on it. They said, well, Pat Mills, through Brian, because he'd been working with him on the ABC Warriors, I'd kind of got to know Pat Mills, where I could go up to him and say hello at one of these conventions. I would send him samples. Brian had got me to, because he was always on the lookout for new talent, and always happy to see new people's work. So I was sending stuff to him on a reasonably regular basis. So he gave me a bit of a tryout, or he suggested that I have a go, and then I'd done a couple of sample pages for the was it the Magnificent Seven, the Kev Walker one? What was that one?
Oh, the not Magnificent. No, it was Chronicles of Chaos.
That's right. Yeah. Well, anyway, I got a couple of samples through Brian. I can't remember. It was a long time ago. But for some reason, I remember Pat Mills ringing me up and saying, "Do you want to have a go at doing a couple of pages of this to see how you get on?" Obviously, I jumped at the chance, and I'd got a couple of pages. Didn't, you know, it was okay-ish. But Kev got the job. I sort of knew Kev because he used to work at Games Workshop as well. I'd sort of known him, got to know him there. He got the gig, but then because they were fairly interested in getting it as much painted stuff in as they possibly could. They said, well, you go sort of get second prize, and you get this. That was when I did a one-off of the Nemesis Deadlock thing, and then that sort of took off from there. So that was how that came to be, really.
Because I mean, this is the opportunity that I love, where I get to recount possibly my favourite anecdote that I've ever had from told to me on the podcast, which is when we had Kev Walker on a few years ago, and he was talking about Chronicles of Chaos, and he said that he happened to be in the 2000 AD office, handing over, because he was inking Steve Dillon on the Harlem.
That's right. Yeah.
Harlem Heroes reboot, and some pages from Bisley came in, and apparently Richard Burton picked them up and said, "Oh, if only we had more people like Simon Bisley." And Kev just pipes up, going, "Oh, I can paint."
Yeah.
But he said he'd never picked up a paintbrush in his life by that point, so he had to go home.
Well, that's kind of So, well, he was kind of along the same sort of line, really. So that was the. Well, he had, because as far as I knew, what he'd been doing was painting packaging for was it Terry's York, one of these sort of Easter egg places. He had been or sort of a real commercial sort of illustration, but he'd been painting stuff for them, which is kind of why he was his sort of color sense was and using the sort of gouache and stuff. That was what, as far as I knew, but maybe that was wrong. I don't know, but probably best to say he's never picked up. I don't think he'd done any comic stuff in it with the paintbrush, but but anyway, he obviously took to it quicker than I did. So that was that one. Yeah.
Let's talk about Nemesis and Deadlock, because I got a real sense reading at the time and rereading it recently of just how classical your anatomy seemed, because you've got quite a few characters in there. You've got gods, effectively. You've got Nemesis and Deadlock fighting away, and it feels very much like you were drawing on that influence of Frazetta, that kind of
absolutely,
rippling muscles and all this, that, and the other.
Yeah. Well, that's absolutely true. That was it. That was what it was, and then that was the script. That was what I was coming from, I suppose.
We've kind of touched on it already. The whole 2000 AD, after the success of Slaying the Horn God, wanted more Bisleys.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
There was only really one of them. Do you think it was? I mean, what's your feelings about having been one of those creators who comes in, replicating using a painted style, and then, I remember seeing a lot of grumbles at the time, particularly to do with the printing.
It was a problem. Things, absolutely, yeah.
Did you feel a little bit hard done by when the kind of printed page came through?
Oh, absolutely, and also back to what you were saying about what Kev was saying. It's absolutely lack of experience. You didn't know. I was just starting out. I think a lot of the other people that were just starting out at the time, they didn't know that on a technical level how to get enough contrast and how these things would print and how to adjust for that. And the printing, the paper wasn't the best, and there was various other technical problems that now. With your, with everything being digital, and there's still a certain amount of sort of color matching between screens and one thing and another, but the difference is unbelievable. And trying to get some of these paintings that would look completely different if you saw them in the flesh to what the printed version would be. It's a wonder they did as well as they did, really.
Because I recall seeing an original page of Nemesis and Deadlock a number of years ago, and
Right.
just being actually quite shocked how bright it was.
Well, yeah,
It-
sure.
it seems like those presses really did a number on you.
Well, yeah, but this is what I say. It was partly lack of experience on my part, and partly the the sort of technical processes. It was just a bit of an unfortunate combination, really. But that's it. That's how you learn, and hopefully you see when it comes back from the printers and it looks like mud, and you think, well, I'll try and improve next time. But that's just the way it goes. Yeah.
Having done mostly, aside from Thrud, mostly done illustration work. What was it like for you producing fully painted artwork on the kind of schedule that you need for a weekly comic?
Well, it was tricky. I mean, this is it. I did kind of end up burning out. It was. I mean, you can do it when you're younger. You can do it. You're keen and you want to put the hours in. And I used to work 7 days a week, and sometimes I'd be working till 2:00 in the morning pretty much every night. Trying to bang this stuff out. I remember the last episode of The Flesh. That's and the long story. I mean, there was 100 and odd pages. The last 6-page episode of that Flesh book, the last one I did the whole thing in a week. And that was getting up. Yeah, exactly. Blind. That was getting up at being at the desk at 8:00 in the morning, working till 2:00 at night, solidly, in order to get the thing turned out. Because it was coming out, it was already out. It was, there was nowhere to run. And you can't keep up. You can do it when you're 20 odd for a couple of years, but you can't keep up. And you think you're going to get better. You're going to get quicker, and you don't tend to get quicker. You tend to get better, whether you do get better or not, but you certainly don't. I seem to have got sort of slower over the years. But you always think, oh, well, next time I'll speed up because I'll have learned, and I'll speed up. And for some reason you never can. And the real successful people that make a go of doing comics full time are people like Charlie Adlard and Sean Phillips and these kind of guys who can absolutely bang the stuff out, and that is the secret. That's the one thing that people don't tell you. If there was a sort of tip for anyone wanting to do comics for a living, I would say you've got to be able to bang the stuff out. And whatever you can do in a day, you're going to do a page a day. If you can do a page a day, you're better off starting to do a page a day that's not up to scratch, but it's a page and you've finished it, and you'll get better. But if you can do a fantastic page, but it takes you a week, you're always going to take a week. You're never going to get that week down to being able to do it in a day. It's a different discipline. That's the one of the failings of a lot of people who came into it. I mean, 2000 AD is a bit of a halfway house compared to the American comic market, where you've got to be. I did that for about 18 months, doing a page a day, banging it out, and you can either do that or you can't, I think.
So you've done Nemesis and Deadlock, and you mentioned just then the Flesh story that you did, the Legend of Shamana. Now that's much brighter. You'd clearly learned from the experience. And the other thing, don't forget. In my defence, that I'm not for a minute blaming Pat Mills, but if you give 20-something artists had never done any fully painted comics before, and the script is set inside a sort of an ancient pyramid, and it's all supposed to be gloomy, and with red, and the figures are various forms of this red energy, which is a difficult sort of thing to do anyway. It's going to end up gloomy, So the whole point. The thing about
the flesh stuff is actually set out in the daylight, so that was a help,
Well, the Nemesis Deadlock thing always had that kind of Mask of the Red Death.
Yeah, well, that was in the script, that was
really?
that was it. Oh yeah, well that sort of the whole thing. It was inside. There was a big sort of ziggurat thing that they sort of came across to, and it was all sort of inside that, so it was with all these pillars and everything. So it was always going to be a bit of a sort of gloomy affair, even with whoever was on the art, I think.
Because with the Legend of Shamana, I guess the next major challenge was drawing dinosaurs in action. I remember being very impressed that you had dinosaurs with feathers as well.
Well, that was again. This was Pat. This was. He always does his homework and he finds these things, and that was the absolutely in the script that these things should be have feathers, and that was sort of cutting edge stuff that he'd been reading in National Geographic or whatever, because that's what he used to do. He'd rip all these pages out of National Geographic and various things and sort of stay them all together and stick them in the post, and say this he wants to be like this and notes all over it and like this but not like that, So that was all him, yeah.
It's almost mind-bending to try and remember the days before the internet of
yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
So what was your relationship like with the editors at the time? Because if you were kind of under pressure to get things done and having to work 7 days a week, it was just a case you were so glad to be sort of in there thinking, oh, this is me now. This is I've kind of made it. I'm working for 2,000 a day. How fantastic! All I've got to do is just making sure, make sure you get the job done. And get it in on time and hit your deadlines and keep your nose clean, and that was kind of it, really. Yeah. So, was the culture different to how you'd experienced it at Games Workshop? Because it sounds like you'd had much more kind of involvement and back and forth and probably.
Well, no, not really. To be doing this, there was camaraderie. Well, there was camaraderie. No, I say camaraderie. I mean, the thing is. All these jobs, being freelance, you don't see anyone for 12 months at a time, and then if you're working for 2000 AD, you would go to, it used to be UCAC, the big London comic convention, and you'd meet people there, and you'd meet all these other people, writers and artists and everything else, and sort of schmooze with them a bit and get to meet them down there. Games Workshop, they used to have Games Day. And then we used to go. There was a couple of games days. One was in London. I can't remember. There was the other one. I think the other was in Derby. But I used to go over. They have a sort of bus with all the staff going down there. So I would go over to Nottingham, on the sort of Thursday, Friday, hang around in the studio for a day or so, meet everyone, and then we'd all go on the bus over up to the show at Games Day and have the weekend over there and come back. So it was a similar sort of idea. In fact, you work on your own and you just went in and you speak to people on the phone and you just go in once a year and get to meet these people and have a bit of a beano and then come away for another 12 months. It was a similar sort of idea. That was about it really. Yeah.
One interesting consequence of the whole kind of post-Bisley thing is that I think it continued a lot longer than people realised. That he did Judgment on Gotham, the Batman Judge Dredd series, and then you had the three sequels, one of which you drew, which was the Ultimate Riddle.
Yeah.
Was that just literally a job that came in and they were like, right, you do painted stuff, let's get you in on this? How did that come about?
Well, kind of really, as far as I was at the time, what happened with that was that if you remember, the two films were due to come out that year. It was the Stallone Dredd film and a Batman film were both coming out in the summer, and they wanted a tie-in. And Glenn Fabry had been working on the Die Laughing, and he'd been working on this for about, I don't know how many years at this point. It was going it was making slow progress. So they had a sort of bit of a sort of flap and said, "Well, we need someone to so we can get something out that'll be in the shops when these 2 films come out." So I know this guy. Like I say, I was saying before, this guy can keeps his head down and turn stuff out reasonably on time. Let's give him a go, you know. And it was, and there was a whole list. I think they were working down the list of people. It was down to Alan Grant and John Wagner, because I got to know them, and they had a list of people working for 2000 AD. They were doing pages stuff, and they said, right, well, you know, and it was my turn next on the list, I think. Yeah, and that was basically yeah.
Because Dermot Power also worked on that story.
Yeah.
Was that, you know, and not casting any aspersions, and just trying to work out what happened? Was that because you were behind, or had that been?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I got the phone. I was just finishing off this is kind of what happened. I previous to that, I did the Flesh job, and then I got the job. Then I was doing the Son of Mean Machine. Well, I was doing the Son of Mean Machine because Chris Halls had worked on it for. He'd had this. John Wagner had written the script for Chris Halls, who had made a start on it, and there was a few pages appeared in one of the yearbooks, and he had done about the first 2 episodes, I think, and that had sort of run into the sand because he was getting film work and off on his fabulous stellar career. So they said, right, well, this script is too good to waste. So again, I was drafted in to start that again and finish that off. So I was just coming to the end of that. And this was sort of Christmas. This was November, sort of December time. And then I got a phone call. I think I got a phone call from Alan Grant. I said, get some pages together and send them off to these guys at DC. So I said, oh, yeah. So he said, yeah, never mind. Oh, yeah, just get them sent off. So that was what I did. Next thing, I got a phone call. How would I fancy doing this Batman Judge Dredd crossover? So that was, but the whole thing was, by the nature of it, a bit of a rush job because it needed to be done and out in the shops before the next summer. So there was, so I made a start. I started it at the beginning of the year. I was working as hard as I could. But you could see they had an absolute fixed deadline. I wasn't going to hit it. So they said, right, who else? You know, we're going to get somebody else in to finish off. And there was various other names that were mooted. And I think I suggested Dermot because I sort of knew Dermot. And I thought he would be a better match for my sort of style. And there were some of the other people that suggested would have been, I'm not mentioning them, but sort of jarred a bit, I would have thought. So anyway, so that was how that sort of came about, but I'd already done, because I'd never worked for them before. I'd already done some rough page layout, so I had the whole thing roughly laid out. So they sent my final page layouts for the last 15 pages or whatever it was over to Dermot, and then he sort of worked them up in his own style and sort of took it from there, and that was why that worked out as it was, and that was the story with that. Yeah,
the Batman Judge Dredd stories are such a seminal moment in the history of Judge Dredd, and remain so popular. What was your, you know, you like you said, you had your head down, you just wanted to get it done. Deadlines were tight, but I mean, that must have been quite a thrill to be doing not just Judge Dredd, but also Batman. Oh,
absolutely. Oh no, definitely. I mean, that's it. It was absolutely big time. I thought, yeah. Oh no, it was fabulous. Yeah, I couldn't believe my luck. Yeah, no, definitely.
Because I'm also aware that of a card that you did, because I mean the mid-90s were the time for the big Fleer trading card sets that created this huge bubble and eventually impacted on comics, but that's another story entirely. Yeah. You did one in 1996 called Sherlock Joker Strikes Out, which is like a mashup of Sherlock and the Joker.
Yeah,
in this very extremely exaggerated way. Do you have any memory of how that came about?
Oh, sure. Well, again, like a lot of these things, that was in the script. It was by that time, after I did we did the Batman Dredd thing. Then I got my feet, and as these things go, I was sort of come to the attention to the people at DC. So and then also with Alan, Alan Grant. So I was then offered the job of doing some Lobo stuff. So I was doing some Lobo stuff, and also thanks to Alan again, because the painted stuff covers for Shadow of the Bat. So I was trying to pencil a monthly book and do a fully painted cover every month, and I was kind of couldn't refuse any of these jobs, and it was fantastic. And I was sort of trying to juggle all these plates, and then they got in touch because Doug Munch had written this 90. It was a new idea. It was a story over 90 odd trading cards, and it was the whole sort of story. Would I be interested in doing any of those? Well, I was busy tied up with those, but again, then Dermot was there, so he got a bunch of those to do. But as part of the story, there was like a side story. So the cards were all numbered. So every 10 cards, I think it was 90 cards. So there was 9 cards. So card 10, card 20, right the way through. They were always the Joker's spin on it, the Joker's angle. So that they were a little individual subset on their own. So they said, well, what about you just doing those 9 cards? So that was fantastic. So I did those. And one of those was the whole thing was a bit of a mystery. And then that was the idea was the Sherlock jokes. It was the Joker putting his Sherlock Holmes hat on, trying to figure out the answer to this mystery. And that was well, there was 2 cards for well, there was one with him with the magnifying glass, and the other one with his before and after the magnifying glass, and that's right, and the magnifying glass shattering. And they were just 2 cards of these sort of 9 as part of this subset of this full set. Yeah,
because that to me sounds like one of the most 90s thing ever was the ultimate overlap between comics and trading cards.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely, yeah.
But it's interesting you describe you getting the ultimate Riddle got your feet under the table at DC, because you mentioned there was other Batman stuff that you did, and I think you ended up doing some Justice League of America stuff as well, didn't you?
The only Justice League stuff there was a sort of, again, on the spin-off they did a while later. It was like it was kind of to do with the Lord of the Rings films, and they did like a fantasy take on it, again fully painted, and they just roped in. It was a bit of a mishmash of a thing, really. They got Mike Kaluta to redesign all the characters as if they were sort of Tolkien-esque sort of fantasy characters, and then various people were doing a few pages each of this thing, because again they couldn't commit to one artist doing the whole. I think a lot of these things come down to practicalities of getting stuff out to the marketplace and time and everything else, commercial pressures. So, and I mean that's the thing with fully painted comics, it takes so long to do. So you commit one story of any length is going to take you at least 12 months. Well, in the American market in particular, they can't see that far ahead to know what's going to be needed 12 months ahead. So they've got to find ways around it to turn the stuff around. And that was a case in point. So there was me, and Jim Murray did a few pages, and Liam Sharp, and Greg Staples, various other usual suspects really on that one. Yeah.
It's that thing when people talk about somebody like Frazetta, who is such a major influence on you, that why are there not more Frazetta comics? Well, have you seen his work? This stuff takes time and
yeah, well, sure, yeah.
Ultimately, comics are a quick medium. They
absolutely. Well, this is it. As I say, that's the thing. That's one thing. That's the lesson that you I would say to anyone that wants to start out and make a go of it. And that's why a lot of these web comics and things you see are basically stick figures, because you can bang these things out. But then that's another rants for another day, I suppose. Yeah.
Now, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to 2000,
Right.
when you effectively withdrew from mainstream comics.
All right.
But do you want to talk a little bit about where you were at the time and the kind of decisions you were making about the work you wanted to do?
I'm trying. I'm trying to. Well, I think. Well, kind of the decisions were made for me, as far as I can remember. I mean, that's it. Really the sort of fully painted thing had kind of run its course, and then that was why and I'd been experimenting with. I'd got a computer and started doing a bit of colouring in Photoshop, one thing and another. And then that was when I decided to put together the first sort of self-published Thrud comic. But really, it was a case of well, what happened was I was working on I was working for DC, penciling Lobo, and I was penciling every month, and again at the time I couldn't really even pencil. I couldn't really pencil a page a day every day, so I was always running late on that, and it was struggling. And then it was getting inked by this US inker, and when I got the pages back, I could see why he'd done it like that, but that wasn't what I meant, and I just didn't like the finished result. So I thought, well, not only am I breaking my back here, the stuff that I'm producing, I don't particularly like, through no fault of anyone. Just that we're both, looking at these things in different directions. I'm not, saying anyone was doing anything wrong. And I think, well, so the answer, if I'm going to be spending my time producing any sort of comics, I need to be more involved with what the finished product looks like. And it was kind of that, really. And also, I didn't really have, because I'd spent so many previous years doing fully painted stuff, and it was that long since I'd done any black and white stuff. I didn't really have a style that I could call my own that was that was a recognizable sort of style. So there was time to get a bit of a style together, and also, try and get something you can do in a reasonable amount of time to sort of get it out and make it worthwhile doing. And that was the way that sort of came together, I suppose.
I mean, that sounds vaguely similar to Disraeli's career, so Matt Brooker's career, where as computers came in, colouring all of a sudden became a very different prospect, and so you see a lot of early adopters in the 90s get a lot of work as colourists because they know how to use the technology. Had your time as a painter doing all those fully painted comics, had that given you a particular colour sense?
Well, I hope so. I would like to think so. Yeah, I mean, that's something I've got. Something I would have opinions on what looked good and what didn't, what worked and what didn't. So yeah, absolutely. Whether I know what I'm talking about is another matter. But that's I've got I've got opinions on it. Put it that way. Yeah.
And during this effectively transition period, what kind of work were you picking up as you were, working on colour and things like that?
Well, I suppose around this sort of time. This is when I started doing the working for Wizards of the Coast, doing the magic cards. That's right. And then I was doing a lot of stuff for Dungeon Magazine, Dragon Magazine. It was sort of fully painted. Again, the technology had moved on, so you could do spot illustration work, but you could do fully painted, full colour stuff. So I was doing at that sort of time. I was doing stuff as I started doing stuff for the magic cards, and then on the back of that, working for when Wizards of the Coast took over Dungeons and Dragons TSR, I was doing various sort of internal spot illustrations for them. So that was what I was probably doing most of the time. Yeah.
Did that feel to a certain extent like things coming full circle? That Dungeons and Dragons the brand that started.
Sure, in a
the
way,
whole
yeah,
game thing off.
absolutely, yeah. Well, that's it. I was back to doing the role playing stuff instead of the comic stuff. Yeah, so that was the similar sort of subject matter, but there was a bit of that, I guess. Yeah.
And I mean, we've already mentioned this. That you'd returned to Thrud after a break of a dozen years or so. Was that? Well, why was that? Why did you go back and start with him again?
Well, I had this sort of idea for this new style, getting this sort of slightly different technique of doing comics together, and I've been experimenting with it. And then I was actually over in New York at a Magic the Gathering sort of tournament, and one of the judges came over and said, "Oh, fantastic! Great to meet you." He was an English guy, and he was saying that he'd been a massive Thrud fan. "Oh yes, you're the guy who does Thrud. Oh yeah, never mind all this magic guys." And I thought, "Oh, okay, that's nice of him to sort of say that." And various other things. I mean, I'd been asked to go up to Aberdeen to do a signing up there. Must have been around the same sort of time, and we were walking up. I remember walking up the road to the venue, and I was saying to the guy, "Well, okay, what are people going to be interested in? Because I've done, working for DC, working for 2000 AD, working for Games Workshop. What are magic cards? What do you think the audience are going to be?" And he said, "Well, mainly they want to see you because of Thrud." So I said, "Oh, right, okay, interesting." So I'd had a couple of run-ins like that with people that are saying, "Oh yes, we fondly remember Thrud." And then I was looking for a vehicle to put this to get this new style together. So I said, "Well, I'm kind of missing a trick here. I can. The technology means I can look into doing a bit of self-publishing. So instead of having a portfolio, you've actually got a comic to give to people to say, look at this is what I can do." And so everything kind of came together, and that was how that sort of formulated.
It is an interesting parallel there between your decision to move to a new style and the one that Kev Walker had chosen to. He'd been inspired by Mike Mignola's work on Hellboy.
Yeah.
And do you feel that to a certain extent you had become pigeonholed as a painter as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean that's it. There's no two ways about it. That the sort of painted thing that at the time was deeply unfashionable, and the work on that side of things had dried up. But I'd say the one of the big downsides of comics, as well as the quality of the printing, which has probably got better, is the amount of time that you've got to invest, because typical comics strip scripts are what they are, and the stuff is without deriding it. These things are turned around in a certain time, and they're done on a fairly sort of regular basis, sort of banged out to a certain extent. And then to pick any one of those at random and say, right, well, you're going to be working on nothing else for the next 12 months, 18 months. You think, well, really? It's not, it doesn't necessarily, the end product doesn't necessarily justify the amount of your work and that has gone into it. I'm not deriding any of these things, but it's a disproportionate amount of time that it takes to produce a fully painted comic strip, which isn't necessarily any better than one done in a traditional way. Let's put it like that.
The style that you settled on, the one that you would set out to create, how did that significantly differ from your early work? That the black and white stuff that you've been doing. What had you drawn on to create this new style?
Well, it was probably just a bit looser, a bit more open, a bit cleaner, because I'd learned that and there was need to. I mean, really, a lot of the stuff was very open, and it was the colouring that was holding the thing together. Because without, I mean, I don't know if you've seen any of Keith Giffin's Trenches stuff. It was kind of similar to that. That you can imagine that without the colouring, you wouldn't know what the hell was going on, and it didn't look much, and it was the colouring that kind of made it. So I've tried to sort of tighten things up since then. But originally, that was the thing there. It was more or less a vehicle for the computer colouring rather than a style of its own. But that's looking back. I don't know. But
around about this time, was I believe you were doing some lecturing of your own.
Really?
Yeah. In the early 2000s, you were doing some college lecturing, I think, weren't you?
No, well, the only I can see what that sort of Chinese whisper. The only thing that got happened there, I remember what's he called, Barry, the guy that did the self-publishing thing.
Barry Renshaw. Barry
Renshaw, yeah. Well, Barry Renshaw was at the local. There's Liverpool Community College, and Barry Renshaw was studied there. And there was a guy, I'm trying to think of the Ian, he died for you. He was a really nice guy. Ian, somebody was the tutor. Anyway, he kind of knew Brian, the tutor, and he got a bunch of these guys to come up to this thing I was telling you about previously in Preston, to this Preston Speculative Fiction Group. So they were all sort of, cross-pollination with all that going on. And on the back of that, I was invited to come down to the community college for an afternoon and give a bit of a sort of chat and a crit and bring some of my work in and one thing and another. And that's what I did. And it turns out one of the guys I was talking to, I bumped into him, later when I was doing the self-publishing, was Barry Renshaw. And I'd kind of forgotten about that. And I said, oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Anyway, that's where that's sort of sprung from, but it wasn't really going down as a lecture. But as I say, it was a one-off, sort of guest appearance at this Liverpool Community College. That's where that's sprung from, I guess.
Right. I get you. We may well have walked past each other because I was at the Liverpool Community College. Yeah, doing the journalism course.
Okay.
Around about that time. So yeah.
Oh, right. Well, what can you remember the name of the guy that was doing the comic course thing?
I honestly, you know what? I didn't even know they did a comic course. My life could have turned out very differently if I had known that.
Right. Okay.
Not necessarily gone into journalism, but no, that was my kind of pre comics industry days. But yeah, no. It's weird how things kind of cross over. We may well have walked past each other in the street.
Yeah, and we went. I remember he took me over to the Everyman, the Everyman Bistro afterwards.
Oh, lovely! I could never afford to eat in there. I always had to go next door to the what was it called, the Varsity Pub.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Cheap alternative. But anyway, I've got to stop reminiscing now. I mean, around about this time, you did I think 4 issues of Thrud the Barbarian. As a small
five in the end. It was
5. Right. Cool.
Yeah.
But in 2002, you returned to 2000 AD with your new style, which I hadn't realised it was. Can't think of another way to say this. I didn't realise it was quite that long ago. Early on, was that something that you had courted, or were you approached?
Well, that was kind of, as I say, that the whole idea of doing this Thrud Con was that I had this new style together. I remember taking it and having a few samples in my. It was that same trip where I was saying the judge guy before I'd mentioned about. They used to do Thrud and everything else. I had some samples of this new stuff. When I was in New York, I called in the DC office. I hadn't worked for them for a couple of years or whatever, but some of the guys I knew were still working there. So as you do, you're in town. I dropped in with my portfolio, and most of the stuff was, because I was doing magic cards and this, like I say, stuff for D&D, was all fully painted stuff. And I had a few samples of this comic strip style in the back of the portfolio, and it didn't really register, and I was quite pleased with it. That was what I was doing at the time. I was sort of buzzing on it, thinking, well, wait till they see this. Oh, wow. And it didn't even, it did not compute. They were looking at all the painted stuff and saying, well, actually, we're not really doing any painted stuff at the minute, jog on. So I thought, well, the only way I'm going to get this under anyone's nose is if I do my own comic, and also people have been asking about doing Thrud stuff. So that was the way the two came together. So the whole idea or one of the ideas of doing this Thrud comic was to sort of showcase this new style and potentially get some work. So I launched it at the comic convention down in Bristol, and took a copy over to Matt Smith at on the 2000 AD stand and said, "Hey, Matt, have a look at that." And then he got in touch about doing the Prager story, the Undercity. And then also Cy Spurrier had bought a copy, and then that was he'd shown it to Matt independently and said, "What do you think about this guy for doing this Lobster Random story?" Which he'd had the scripts kicking about for. So that was how that all sort of worked out.
I did want to talk about Lobster Random because it always felt like it fitted in perfectly with your background, with Thrud and with that kind of slightly humorous, actiony way that you drew. It seemed like a perfect fit at the time.
Well, as I said, obviously, Cy thought the same thing. He saw the Thrud cover and said, "Oh, this is what I'm after." So that was how that, and he presented it to Matt. And as I say, Matt had I can't remember the exact sort of chronological order, but I got the call. I did the Undercity story, and then went on to do Lobster Random after that. Yeah. But I know they both got a copy of the Thrud comic at the Bristol show.
What are your feelings about Lobster Random as a series? Because it was very Spurrier. I mean, it was one of those series that in tone and content was very much what he does. What was your feeling about it as you were working on it?
Well, it was great. It was okay. It was a bit. It made me feel like a sort of tired old man with this sort of puppy sort of gambling about and sort of running me ragged and throwing ideas at me left, right, and centre. I was struggling to keep up, because some of the things, there would be these pages. You'd have these fantastic. Every page, I'd have about 10 ideas that any other writer would be able to sort of spin a whole series out of. And these were just sort of throwaway ideas. He was just sort of firing at me left, right, and centre. If it was in a science fiction book where you could explain what was going on, that was great. But to try and draw the whole thing so you could get his explanation into a visual idea, so that people would be able to figure out what was going on in one panel amongst 7 others on a page, was a bit of a struggle at times, I've got to say, but I did my best. And then sometimes I said, "We're not having that. I'm not even going to bother with that. Nobody's interested. Forget it." So there was a little bit of that went on, I must admit. But I tried to keep as true to the script as I possibly could.
Having developed this new style, were you thankful for it when you're dealing with such a dense script?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, you couldn't have done a painted that. Oh no, forget it. No, you couldn't have painted that. No. Well, you could, but it would have. I probably would still be working on it now. But that's yeah. Oh no, that was the idea. But again, the more you start adding to it and you start sort of refining and being a bit more subtle and bringing a few more layers in and a few more colours and a few more, a bit more modelling and everything. And you soon end up taking you long to do 2 pages of that are just 2 pages of fully painted stuff, So that's just unfortunate, but that seems to be the way I keep dragging myself down, That's one of those things.
Because you worked on Lobster Random for a number of years. I mean, it started in 2003 and went on for most of the decade. Was that the main source of stuff that you were doing, or were you still working on the Magic the Gathering cards?
Oh, so I was doing Magic cards. I think between those two, the Magic cards and that would be more or less what I've been doing for that sort of period. Yeah. I didn't have much time to do anything else, but yeah.
It wasn't until I interviewed Greg Staples a few years ago for the Judge Dredd magazine that I actually got a handle on Magic? Because up until that point, I'd heard of it. I think there might have even been a promotion, like some cards in 2000 AD or something.
Right.
And I'd never really got a beat. I was like, oh, it's a card game, but that stuff is massive, isn't it?
Oh, what? And it's gone even bigger. Yeah, I mean, this is it. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole new, as far as the artists go, there's a whole, it's got new legs again. And what's happened now? I mean, I don't know about the game itself, but there's a whole new thing gone on with the original artwork, and that is now crazy, and there's a whole new lot of younger artists, mostly from various people, actually being Kev is still the number one guy, for Magic cards, really. He's done more than anyone else, and there's likes of me and Greg kicking about, but there's a load of new people. But what they're doing is they will do a sort of 2 foot square oil painting for one of these little cards, because they know that painting, they can sell that painting after the event when the card's out for megabucks, So, but it's too big for it doesn't justify the actual commission for the card, but it's done as a piece of actual artwork of an original piece of artwork to be sold as a painting afterwards, and that's the whole new sort of thing that's just taken off in the past couple of years after the people like me have given our stuff away for relatively peanuts, It's,
well, I guess it's no different to the growth in the trade of original artwork for comic books. I remember buying a page off Chris Weston, for example, at Bristol in like 2001, 2002 for 20 quid.
Sure. Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, this. I think it's, and again, there's a lot of people. I mean, Greg included, that have gone back to doing painting stuff, and they went out to digital, and then now they've gone back over to painting stuff because there's the added value that you can sell the paint, and after the digital thing, is you've got prints and whatever, but the actual finished painting is the thing that people go nuts for,
You've been a fairly consistent presence in the prog over the last sort of 15, 20 years. Have you had any difficulty kind of flipping back and forth between your painted style for the things like the Magic cards and your comic book style?
I don't know. It always develops. It depends. If you haven't done any for a while, if you're doing one certain style of thing for a protracted time, you haven't done any comic stuff for a while, you sort of takes you a while to get back and get your groove back, kind of thing. And things are always changing, and I've got stuff that I'm doing away from anything in particular, scribbles and sketchbooks and things. Then you think, well, actually, if you're not careful, what you do is you go back, you sort of develop your style, but if it's not being done to any finish or done for the public consumption, you end up going back, reverting to the style you were working in 5 years ago. When you get a paying job, because you think, well, that's what people will want. It's a bit of a strange one. That's the way it goes. I think. There's obviously people like sort of Mick McMahon, and every time you see something they've done, you think, wow, look at that. Where's that come from? But other people find the style and just keep doing what they do.
Well, I guess that leads me into my next question, which is, how has this your newer comic style evolved? Because looking at the early 2000s stuff, looking at Lobster Random, and then getting a sneak peek of the new Dredd that you've done, it's now so recognizably yours, but it seems to have evolved. You seem to have become more comfortable with it, and particularly with the color sense that you're bringing to things. So the colors, although still muted, seem stronger. How have you felt that style evolve over time?
Well, I think it's just that it's something you can't really put your finger on. You just, as I say, you're just doing the stuff, and you're just trying to improve, and you just evolving and looking at other people's work and dragging other influences in. I wasn't really like to sit and analyze it. It's just what you do. Hopefully you get better, but that's not necessarily the case. But that's you refine these things and hopefully onwards and upwards. But whether that's right or not, I don't know. Maybe you lose some stuff along the way. Who knows?
Super stuff. Thank you so much to Carl for taking the time to chat away. I hope you enjoy that. Tune in later this week for another episode from the 2000 AD Thrillcast. And look out for more fantastic interviews. We'll be broadcasting twice a week during the lockdown to make sure that your isolation continues to be thrill powered. So make sure you're all staying safe. Make sure you're all looking after one another. And until next time, Splundig Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Thrill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000ADonline.com.